when we get enmeshed back into a narcissistic relationship, a marriage, you know, in a narcissistic relationship, it's like that process reverses. It becomes a little bit enmeshed, and ultimately you become, again, the egg and the yolk, and your entire identity is enmeshed within that narcissistic person.
Yeah.
And so that is what I'm referring to with boundaries, is knowing where I start and stop and where others start and stop.
Yeah. I would, can I comment on your,
Absolutely.
okay. So when you
Absolutely.
get into adulthood, I would just visualize it slightly differently. So instead of two separate sort of boundaried, whatever the,
Circles. Yeah.
separate circle, yeah, a sign of healthy development would be that there's a togetherness that does overlap at times, and then a separateness, and that you feel it's a fluidity, in other words, that
Yeah.
you feel comfortable enough merging at certain moments. Think about sexual intimacy, right? How intense that could get, or
Yes.
feeling deep empathy for somebody. So you have to have that. You don't want to be too separate. You want to have the fluidity where you could step in, but more importantly, unlike the earlier when you said you regress, but to be able to step out. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really part of therapy too. The deep sort of psychoanalytic work, a psychodynamic work that I do, it's never that like completely separate image that you described in adulthood. As a good therapist, you have to be able to step in. And I talk about this quite a bit in my podcast, and people really have strong feelings about it, in terms of when you're working with a narcissist. And an example I use quite a bit is the vulnerable narcissist who's living at home and is living like a parasitic life off, living off of his parents. And I always emphasize containment and helping the child, not creating a boundary or kicking him or her out. I mean, at some point you may have to do that if they just become too abusive, but initially containing, stepping in, holding, and people
Mm-hmm.
really object to that. And part, like you said, Renee, I think in that image is like, we feel like we need to be so separate from these people, but a
Mm-hmm.
sign of health is to be able to step in and step out. So that's the only
Absolutely.
thought.